So in the last few lectures we've talked about calculating return, and we've talked about calculating volatility. And we've talked about the idea of diversification, which was if I put multiple assets together, I can reduce the overall risk of a portfolio. Now this lecture this time discusses the limits of building a portfolio, the limits of diversification, in other words. So our goal here is to understand that limit and then sort of describe market risk, systematic risk, diversifiable risk. So let's think about this. If we're holding one stock, should we add another stock to our portfolio? Well, most definitely yes. We get diversification benefits as long as the stocks are not perfectly correlated. In real life situations, you never find stocks that are perfectly correlated. So in real life, you add another stock to your portfolio, you're going to do some good. So let's say we're adding two stocks. Should we add another? Well, yes. Now what we'd find is if we keep adding more and more stocks, eventually when we get between about 30 and 40 stocks, when we add another stock, we don't get any more benefits. The risk stays the same. So essentially, whenever I add a new stock, we're diversifying it immediately. We're getting rid of all the firm-specific risk. So the larger our portfolio, the more diversification I can get, but at a decreasing rate. So there's limits. We look at the graph, sort of describes what I'm talking about. As we add stocks in our portfolio, remember between 30 and 40, eventually we sort of reach an asymptote, if you think back to calculus, or a sort of a point of no crossing, a boundary line, if you will, where we can't get any lower risk. And really what we have at that point is just a fully diversified portfolio that is composed of only market risk. If you think back to the very first lecture of this unit, we said market risk was risk that is due to changes in the overall economy, such as war, political policy, GDP, unemployment, things such as that, consumer outlook on how they think the country is doing. That's risk that is shared by everybody. So if we look at that line there, that is really the average market risk of our economy. Now some stocks have greater exposure to the market than others, but everyone shares sort of the same direction with market risk. So if the market gets better, everybody gets better. If the market gets worse, everybody gets worse. Some stocks get worse than others. So we call this general economic or systematic risk. This risk I cannot get rid of no matter how many stocks I have in my portfolio. Now on the flip side here, the good news is as we add stocks, we get rid of firm-specific risks, so we can diversify. And then going back to the 30 or 40 stocks, this is the motivation of a mutual fund. By putting a group of stocks or assets together, we can provide diversification for an investor at a small price. Remember, the way a mutual fund works is you have small ownership in a variety of firms. You may not own a full share, in fact, but at a reduced price. So you get partial ownership in multiple firms. You have a diversified investment. So going forward, what are we going to do with this? Well, really what we're going to start thinking of is if I'm building a portfolio, this graph sort of tells me I can get rid of all my firm-specific risk. So if I want to reward an investor, what should I reward him for? Well, really, we should think about rewarding him for risk he can't avoid. That's that general economic risk or market risk. Now hit pause and check this slide out for a moment. So it sort of summarizes what I said. We should really only reward an investor for risk they can't avoid. That's the market risk of an individual stock. Now where we're going with our next and final lecture here on risk is we're going to compare this market or systematic risk of an individual stock against the average investment out there. And basically our whole point will be saying, is this stock riskier than the average opportunity or is it less risky? And if we know that, we can start pricing the risk and determining a return we should ask for. Now, this last slide just summarizes what I talked about, market risk and firm risk. So hit pause if you need to read this again. But we only reward investors for market risk or systematic risk, risk they can't avoid.